Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
One thing that you can say about the modern Tory party, it is not exactly instinctively loyal. Theresa May's faced poison dart after poison dart aimed at her back all week as Brexiteers and Remainers lock horns and general discipline appears to break down. How should she respond? How can she respond? David Lidington of the Cabinet Office is as close as she has to a deputy. Welcome, Mr Lidington. I think I'm going to save your blushes. I'm not going to sit here and read out all the disobliging things that your colleagues have said about the Prime Minister. Can I just ask you, however, what's your messages to all of those people saying all those things about how dull she is, how she's got no vision, how she's losing her grip?
I think look at what she says and what she's doing in office. You've got a woman there who has inherited an immense challenge in delivering a Brexit that will give prosperity and security for the United Kingdom and all its people for the future. But she's not only doing that. When I sit with her, when I go in for the morning meeting at number 10, where I see the flash in the eye, what really is driving her in politics, it's not performing in front of the media. It's public service. It's making a difference on some of those big social policy challenges that successive governments have put to one side. It's getting the right housing so our young people can live somewhere. It's getting social care sorted out. It's getting technical and vocational education fixed so that people will have secure jobs and careers in an age when, artificial intelligence, robots are shaking up all our notions about employment. That's what drives her on.
But speaking of robots, I mean, your colleagues are being really, really rude about it. Is your message that they should belt up?
I think what I say to all my colleagues is the Conservative family, left, right and centre, because we're a broad church, needs to come together in a spirit of mutual respect. There are differences in any broad church, and look at what the bigger picture is showing. The bigger picture is showing that after 8 years in government, we are still neck and neck with the Labour Party in the polls. We're taking seats off them in places like Bolton in local government elections last week. And the good news, Andrew, the good news, the other thing my colleagues need to remember, just look at last week's news. Unemployment, lowest level for 40 years. Employment, record levels. New borrowing figures, lower than expected. New growth figures, higher than expected. That's the Conservative record.
So people like you who said that we were going to be in a disastrous position after Brexit have been proved wrong. Oh,
I've been delighted by the way in which the British economy is more resilient than I feared it was going to be. But there is a formidable task, as we've all said, in negotiating the right deal for the UK.
OK, I'm going to give you a quote. We are taking two completely interconnected and aligned economies with high levels of trade and selectively moving them, hopefully, very modestly apart. Do you agree?
I think that what we're talking... That's the Chancellor, I think, you're quoting.
Do you agree with him?
What I agree with him is that on the day after we leave, as the EU withdrawal bill in front of Parliament now is making clear, is that business will be able to operate to the same legal framework and regulations as it is now. That's what he was talking about.
He wasn't talking about the transition period. He was talking about the eventual end state. And he said that he hoped, for the sake of British business, that we were very, very closely together.
Philip has made it very clear that he's fully on board with the approach that the Prime Minister has set out in both her Lancaster House and her Florence speeches last year, when she talked about trying to get a deal in the forthcoming negotiations. We are leaving. I mean, don't be any doubt about that.
I'm sorry, I'm going to do this one more time.
But we're having a future trade agreement that we hope will be as frictionless and as free trade as we possibly can with our neighbours next door in Europe.
OK, we've got two interconnected economies and we are selectively moving them, hopefully very modestly apart. Do you agree?
Well, I'm not going into details about the negotiations.
It's not a detail, it's absolutely crucial. The question is, are we converging still or are we diverging? Are we going to diverge?
The question, of course, we will have the power to choose for ourselves whether or not to diverge once we have left the supranational legal structures of the EU. It is then a matter for a British government and a British Parliament to decide, well, there may be some areas, as the PM set out at Florence, where we want to achieve, frankly, the similar objective to the EU 27, but to do it in a different way. There may be other areas where actually we decide, no, actually we have a slightly different objective in this area. Others, where we're trying to do the same objective through exactly the same means, in which case it makes sense in those areas to work very closely together.
Jacob Rees-Mogg said recently, if everything is delayed for 2 years, as it will be, and then there's high alignment, as it seems there will be, you will find that by 2022, no one will have noticed any difference from having left. Then what will be the point of voting for the Conservatives, you go on to say?
Well, I think, first of all, Jacob, like everybody else, just needs to see how the negotiations go. We're about to start negotiations, and I'm not going to get into detail about that process. Secondly, the very fact that we will have left the European Union is a big deal indeed. The bill in front of Parliament extinguishes the power of the European Court and supranational EU law over the UK. We will have, from next year, a registration system that we've not had before for EU nationals coming to this country to register to show they're entitled to be in the UK. Those are big differences.
So why do you think that people who watch this very closely, like Theresa Villiers this morning, thinks that this is going to be virtually no different from where we are at the moment, that we are not going to really notice a difference? This is a virtual non-Brexit.
Oh, I want, don't get me wrong, Andrew, I want British businesses who trade across Europe and European businesses who trade with supply lines into the UK to have trade continue as undisrupted as possible. And we're aiming to do that while at the same time delivering what the people voted for, which is the bringing back of control over our laws here.
Nobody knows exactly what the people voted for. It comes down to the details of a trade deal. My question is, if you want almost undisrupted trade, then we have to give the Europeans things for that, apparently.
Well,
it's the kind of negotiation that we do.
It's a negotiation, whereas the PM has said repeatedly there's going to be a need for give and take on both sides. It's not just about trade, though. Don't forget that we're very ambitious in terms of security partnerships for the future, police cooperation for the future, because our interests and those of our neighbours in Europe are going to be similar on so many different issues. We want that deep and special partnership that Theresa May's talked about.
One of the great frustrations of public life at the moment is that nothing except Brexit gets discussed. And meanwhile, there's lots of other really important things. Over the last 5 years, rough sleeping in this country has doubled. In the borough in which I live, it's gone up 670%. Why?
It's gone up for a number of different reasons, and part of this is to do with the complexity of the people who often end up sleeping rough, where you're talking about people with mental health conditions, often a history of drug and alcohol.
So all of those things have got worse.
That's why the government has set a very ambitious target. We're pledged to halve rough sleeping by 2022 and eliminate it by 2027. We've set aside a very large sum of taxpayers' money, Andrew,
what have you got wrong up to now, then,
what have you got wrong? What we are doing now to sort it out is that we
you must have got something wrong.
We have backed new legislation which is enabling us, with local authorities in partnership, to address the reasons why people become homeless, sleep rough, so that we prevent it rather than trying to deal with the problem when it occurs. We're also, starting this year, a number of government-funded pilot projects in different parts of the country to deal with some of these really complex cases. You have people who have serious mental health issues.
When we're on government-funded pilot projects, we move on. Can I ask you about one? Can I ask you about one? No, I want to ask you about.
Good to test what works and what doesn't.
Right. Let me ask you about one area where the government has been apparently very bold, because you're supporting legislation so that people who want to change gender can self-identify. I can say, if I want to become a woman, I just identify as a woman, and then I will be treated as a woman. Can I ask you, do you think a trans woman is a woman?
I think that somebody who is transgender, or somebody who's not yet gone through
the operation,
assignment, etc., and feels that they were born into the wrong body, to use the phrase, deserves respect. We should respect people for who they are, however they identify.
I completely agree with that. My question is slightly different.
The question about the law and where that should be was something when Justine Greening was in charge of these matters that she was preparing a public consultation on. Obviously, she's now left the government. Her successors need to just take stock of that and decide how they want to take this issue forward.
Is this still a live proposal by the government that people can simply self-identify as women?
It was one of the issues that Justine was talking about putting out to public consultation, and that is still the case, but there's not yet been that public consultation. These are complex issues, and I think it's right that any proposal like this should be the subject of proper consultation with all people with an interest in this, in order to make sure if we do make a change in policy, let alone the law, we get it right.
LGBT campaigners say that your voting record on those issues has been pretty hostile over the years on gay marriage, on all sorts of other issues, on having a gay envoy to Europe, or LGBT envoy to Europe and so forth. Do you recognise that you have a problem with that community?
I think that, I mean, my voting history on free votes on this is a matter of record, and I've come at it from like a traditional Christian point of view. I have to say, I looked particularly when civil partnerships came in, and my own views changed on that, looking at how gay friends of mine were really affected for the better by that change. I would not vote against civil partnerships and that sort of recognition today. And I think it's a settled issue in any case. What I always tried to do, I mean, when I was at the Foreign Office,
straight answers. Can I just test you one more time on whether you think a trans woman is a woman?
I think that that's a matter for her. She should be treated.
So the answer is basically yes.
Treated as a woman. But to be honest, Andrew, I don't spend time sort of perhaps thinking about this. I would try to deal with the person in front of me as they are with respect to that person, whatever their background, however they describe themselves. In the same way you do when constituents come to see you as a local MP. I prefer, I think when you try to categorise people, put them in pigeonholes, you get into all sorts of difficulties. I
was only asking you because it was a government policy, but David Liding, for now, thank you very much. Let's take a look at what's coming up straight after this programme.
Join us at 10 from Newcastle, where we'll be looking to the left. Does it have a problem with anti-Semitism? Then pornography, harmless fun or deeply damaging to society? And last, drugs. Should places be licensed where it's safe for addicts to take them? See you at 10 on BBC One.
Pressure. The EU 27 will set out the parameters for the next stage of Brexit talks. And on Tuesday, the Lords will begin 2 days of debate on the EU withdrawal bill, thought to be the longest second reading debate in the history of the Upper Chamber. So, who better to talk to than the person charged with steering the legislation through the Upper Chamber, the Leader of the House of Lords, Baroness Evans. We'll be debating Brexit and the future of the House of Lords with Conservative peer and Open Britain supporter Baroness Altman. Also, the Brexiteer and former boss of PR firm Bell Pottinger, Lord Bell. And amid growing concerns about possible miscarriages of justice due to disclosure failures in rape and other cases, we'll be joined by Labour's Shadow Justice Secretary, Richard Burgon. Plus, with the social care system at breaking point, I headed to Liverpool to meet those on the front line to find out exactly what needs to be done. All that, and our weekly look through the Sunday papers, a packed show indeed. But first, it's going to be a busy week for Baroness Evans, the Leader of the House of Lords. The Upper House once again finds itself making headlines for all the wrong reasons this morning. And on Tuesday, the Brexit bill will reach the Chamber for 2 days of debate. Let's speak now to Baroness Evans, who joins me from our central London studio. Baroness Evans, good to see you.
Good morning.
The EU withdrawal bill heads to the Lords this week. What are the chances it returns to the Commons in one piece?
Oh, I think there's every chance it will return to the Commons in one piece. The House of Lords has taken a very constructive role to the Brexit legislation we've had so far. I mean, for instance, we passed the Article 50 bill. Now, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean we won't be having detailed debates, there won't be challenges, and the government has said we're very welcome. We will be listening to constructive suggestions, but we will get the bill through. I'm confident of that.
Well, it does seem likeliest that it's actually after the second reading that we're going to see the problems in the Lords, particularly on the Henry VIII powers, workers and fundamental rights, the devolved provisions affecting, Holyrood, amongst other places. Now, if their lordships act as they say they do and push on these amendments, I mean, there is precious little you can do about it.
Well, as I've said, we're expecting strong debate. I mean, the House of Lords is a scrutinising and revising chamber. That's its job. So the things you're describing is the Lords doing its job. I'm expecting a very constructive discussion, where the Lords come up with suggestions to improve the bill. The government have said we're willing to listen. And we've also said that we ourselves will be bringing forward amendments, particularly around, for instance, the devolved issues that you've mentioned. So I'm expecting long debates, detailed debates, but I'm also expecting a constructive attitude attitude and the Lords to do its job. And of course, don't forget, even when the Lords passes amendments to the bill, it goes back to the Commons, who then have to think about whether they want to accept them or not.
I mean, you say that you're expecting a strong debate. You must also surely be expecting to lose on a number of votes, given the balance of the House.
Well, I'm not a defeatist, Neil. I'm going to go in hoping that the government's case will be won, hoping that we can persuade their lordships of our case. But as I've said, where there are constructive suggestions about improvements that need to be made to the bill, we will be ready to listen, and we will work with their lordships' House to make sure that this bill gets back to the Commons in an excellent state.
It sounds to me almost like you're conceding, Baroness Evans, that the state in which the bill has reached the upper house is not a fit state, that actually there are areas in which it could be improved, and you're simply going to have to accept that.
Well, as I've said, the government listened in the House of Commons. Amendments were made there. We've also said that we ourselves will be bringing forward amendments, and I certainly accept discussions to happen. I expect the bill to be amended. I'm clear about that. But what I also expect is that we will send the bill to the Commons in a good state, because what we all want, this bill is about ensuring that we have laws that work once we leave Brexit. We all want to make sure that our legal system is in the best state it can be, and we will all work together to achieve that.
But for all the talk of strong debate and talk of amendments that you've been mentioning, I mean, in essence, what you are saying is that the government's vision of Brexit, as espoused in the EU withdrawal bill, will not be the one that is returned from the upper chamber. I mean, if the Lords act as they say they will, to block your vision of Brexit, for that is what they are doing, I mean, how far would you go? Frank Field had an interesting suggestion on this programme the other week when he suggested, having the threat, the sword of Damocles of cutting hundreds of members of the upper house might be something that would compel them to vote in a more amenable fashion.
To be honest, we've heard all these speculations before. This was exactly what commentators said when we had the Article 50 bill. Oh no, the Lords will wreck it. Oh no, the Lords will behave unconstitutionally. That didn't happen. The Lords scrutinised the bill. We sent a couple of changes back to the Commons to consider, but the Commons said, thank you very much, House of Lords, but no, we want this bill in the state that we sent it. It came back to us, and the House of Lords did what it does, which is respect the primacy of the House of Commons.
You don't detect that you might be about to enter into a fairly lengthy game of parliamentary ping-pong on this particular issue?
Well, as I said, I know it's going to be a challenge. I'm not disputing that. But what I do believe is that the Lords will enter this in a constructive manner. We will have strong debate. I think the bill will be amended, but we will work with the House of Lords to make sure that a better bill arrives in the House of Commons. The House of Commons will then consider the changes the House of Lords have made, but it will be for them then to decide whether they want to accept them or whether they want to send the bill back to the House of Lords and say, thank you very much, but no. And the House of Lords will respect its role and will respect the primacy of the House of Commons, and we will ensure that we have a legal system that is fit for purpose on the day after we leave the EU, which is what we all want to work towards.
Just in terms of the possibility of reform of the House of Lords, I mean, it is pretty clear that it's in drastic need of it, isn't it? I mean, once again, we have a former MP, now ennobled, Andrew Lansley, is apparently selling his access to a Chinese firm. What on earth is he up to?
Well, we have very clear code of conduct in the House of Lords and very clear guidelines about what is acceptable and not acceptable behaviour. Andrew Lansley has referred himself to the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, which is the right thing to do. She will investigate, and we shall wait to see what the result of her investigation is. But on a regular basis, the House of Lords does an excellent job. I'm very proud to be the leader of the Lords, and I think we will show ourselves in a good light over the next few weeks when we scrutinise and revise very important legislation and make sure that we have a legal system fit for purpose for when we leave the EU.
Sure, but fair enough. Can we just focus on Andrew Lansley for just a second? Are we not at a point where it might just be an idea for our politicians not to take outside work when they're working either in the House of Commons or the House of Lords? I mean, what does it benefit us to have someone like Andrew Lansley, with the experience that he does, essentially selling his skill set to a foreign-based company?
Well, as I said, we have a very clear code of conduct in the House of Lords. We have very clear rules.
It doesn't appear to be clear enough,
have a
because
register
incidents
of
like
interest.
this continue to crop up.
Well, as I've said, we have very clear register of interest, we have a code of conduct, and as I said, the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards in the House of Lords will be looking into what happened. I am not privy to what conversations took place, but it will be investigated, and if action needs to be taken from there, it will.
Are you really the right person to be leading the charge in the House of Lords? I mean, your appointment last year took many of yours and my peers by surprise. Andrew Pearce quoted one saying, Evans is out of her depth, we need a big hitter with Brexit legislation. She was put there because she was Nick Timothy's chum. It's why her days are numbered. I mean, are you Nick Timothy's chum? Is that why you're there?
Well, thank you for your confidence, Neil. It's greatly appreciated. I actually think, if you don't mind me saying, I'm doing a good job in the House of Lords. I think I'm a different face of the House of Lords. I hope your viewers will double take when they see me and think, oh gosh, she's leader of the Lords, is she? We are a changing face. We are a revising chamber. I think I'm doing a good job, and I look forward to leading this bill through the Lords, and I look forward to the constructive discussions which will happen with my colleagues across the House.
We've become very fond in this show of asking what Labour's position on Brexit is this week. I mean, the Tories, we have to say, have become similarly all over the shop of late. I mean, you've got the Chancellor telling Davos this week that changes to the EU-UK relationship would be very modest. I mean, is that the vision of Brexit that you'll be advocating in the Lords? No,
as the Prime Minister's been very clear and set out in her Florence speech our vision for our future relationship with the European Union, and we're looking forward to developing...
Let's be 100% clear. The Chancellor's wrong when he says that the changes to our relationship with the EU will be very modest.
We've been very clear about our relationship and future partnership with the EU. We want a strong and deep partnership, and that is what we will be working towards. But what I'm going to be focusing on in the House of Lords is making sure that we pass a bill that is very important to make sure there are no holes in our laws once we leave the EU. That is important work. It is work that the House of Lords will do it very well, I have no doubt, and I look forward to the weeks ahead.
I mean, it still sounds like you're saying that the Chancellor's wrong. I mean, another thing that's emerged in the papers today, your Brexit negotiators suggesting they're willing to have a longer transition period than 2 years. I mean, in what way is that delivering Brexit?
Well, again, the Prime Minister and indeed David Davis on Friday have been very clear once again. We do expect an implementation period, and we think it will be important because we want to make sure we give businesses and people certainty and to make sure we have one set of changes. And we've been very clear that that will be for a 2-year period.
Yeah, so it's not going to be extended beyond oh, we appear to have lost you. No, you're back again. There we are. You're absolutely clear on this, that any suggestion that there'll be an extension to the transition period beyond 2 years is just not a flyer. It's not going to happen.
I'm sorry, I had a bit of a technical hitch during that question, so I didn't hear the whole question. But as I will repeat and say once again, we have said that we're anticipating a 2-year implementation period. The Prime Minister's been clear about, and David Davis once again reiterated that on Friday.
Can we turn to the Director of Public Prosecutions for a second, Alison Saunders? Now, as you'll be very well aware, she's ordered a review of all rape and serious sexual assault cases to see if there are any problems with disclosure of evidence. She expects, even ahead of this review, that there will be a number of cases that will have to be halted because of the problems with disclosure. That's an absolute disgrace, isn't it? Well, who's at fault? The CPS or the police? What's
absolutely important is that people have confidence in our justice system. That's what we all want to work for. We'll have to see what happens with this review. But what we don't want are miscarriages of justice, and we don't want victims to also not be served by the system. So it's absolutely an important balance to be taken right, and I think we need to make sure we look into this to ensure that we can and the public do have confidence in our justice system. Our legal system is one of the best in the world.
You don't need to look into it, though. I mean, there was a report produced by the CPS Inspectorate back in July of 2017 which said the process of recording details of sensitive material is routinely poor. The revelation by police to the prosecutor of material that may undermine the prosecution case or assist the defence case is where the standards falls below any acceptable standard of performance. That was 7 months ago. There is no need for a review. The problems with disclosure have been well known, and there are most likely people in prison right now who should not be.
Well, I'm not going to speculate on that. I don't feel I can. But what I can assure your viewers is that we take all these issues extremely seriously. My colleague David Gauke will be looking into this very carefully, and we will be looking.
This very problem for 7 months. How is that taking it seriously?
Well, we are taking it very seriously. We do not want to see miscarriages of justice, but we also want to make sure that victims have a fair system with which to go through. That is what we're working towards, and we will be working with the legal profession, with the police, with the CPS, to make sure that the public can rightly have confidence in our justice system, because that's what we all want to achieve.
I mean, I'll say it again. The problems regarding disclosure, not simply in rape cases and serious sexual abuse cases, but across the board, have been known now for many years and have been identified by the Inspectorate since July of last year. So whose fault is this? Is it the police? Is it the CPS? Or is it a succession of Justice Secretaries, Conservative ones at that?
Well, I don't think me casting around aspersions is going to help anyone. It's not going to help the victims of miscarriages of justice, and it's not going to help victims who actually want to bring their case forward. What we need to do is move forward. We need to make sure that the public have confidence in our justice system, and that is what we're all working towards.
Baroness Evans, lovely to speak to you. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
This week, the House of Lords will start 2 days of debate on the EU withdrawal bill. Joining me from, fair to say, opposite sides of the Brexit debate, but the same side of the chamber, Baroness Ros Altman and Lord Tim Bell. Lovely to see you both this morning.
Good morning, Neil.
How bad is it going to be, Lord Bell, as soon as it gets to the House of Lords?
It won't be particularly bad. It's a very open debate. It's a piece of legislation which the government wants to pass, and it wants it to be as good as possible. So to listen to amendments and to listen to argument.
It's going to be plain sailing then, I presume, for the government, Ros?
Well, I don't think it will be plain sailing for the government, but I hope that the government will listen to the genuine concerns expressed from all sides of the House of Lords about what we are going to be able to achieve for the future constitutional status of the UK and the legal framework which we are heading to.
So where exactly do your objections lie? People continually talk, and committees in the House of Lords have mentioned this on a number of occasions, but it's the Henry VIII powers which many people seem most exercised by.
I think that is one of the big issues. You know, the country that we live in has always been a parliamentary democracy where Parliament is sovereign. And Parliament is meant to scrutinise and approve legislation that will affect the country. It is not a country where the executive, a small group of ministers, is allowed to just take decisions on major pieces of legislation, whether it's primary or secondary legislation, and override parliamentary scrutiny. So that's certainly one issue. There are other issues as well, such as, you know, what powers you give to the devolved administrations and what happens to the border in Northern Ireland. Those types of issues, a meaningful vote for Parliament, which is related to the whole area of parliamentary sovereignty, I think will come under significant scrutiny across the House.
I mean, it does strike me that there are some fairly fundamental differences of opinion in the House of Lords, Lord Bell. And given the makeup, given the balance, it's going to be very difficult for the government's vision of Brexit as it currently stands.
Leave chamber. It's very, very heavily in that direction. But that's not the point. This isn't a political debate. It's not about whether we stay or go. There's been a referendum and it voted in favour of going, and that's the position we're in. And so that's what we'll do. But this is a piece of legislation, the purpose of which is to make sure the statute book is correct. And therefore it's not 100% accurate. It needs improvement. Even Keir Starmer said that at the end of the debate, third reading, that the bill was a better bill. And it's worth remembering that the House of Lords is not elected, and it's been passed in the House of Commons. 247 Labour MPs voted against it without any alternative idea whatsoever. And it was passed, third reading, and this is second reading. As it happens, the convention in the House is that there's not normally a division at the second reading, so there probably won't be any division. There may be odd division. The Liberal Democrats are going to make a fuss, they always do. But we all know what their position is.
I mean, it certainly does sound like it's the committee and the report stages where things are going to get very, very, very difficult. But do you understand, though, the position of some of the leading Brexiteers in the lower chamber, that if the bill comes back in a drastically different form, a significantly different form, it will be a failure of the Houses of Parliament to deliver on the will of the people?
No, I think it's a failure to deliver the will of the people if it disagrees with the House of Commons.
Do you understand that view as well, Baroness Altman? The idea that a decision was taken in June 2016, which essentially gave the government the nod to leave the European Union and then gave them the freedom to decide what that exit from the European Union should look like. Not the House of Lords, but the government.
Absolutely. The role of the House of Lords is not to override the Commons. The constitutional role of the House of Lords is to scrutinise and advise if legislation needs, in their view, some significant change or even minor change. You know, we have in the House of Lords the leading judges in our entire legal system. The British people voted in 2016 to leave the EU, and Parliament has respected that decision by triggering Article 50 and is now in the process of trying to deliver what those people who voted leave voted for. What were they promised? Can we deliver it? How can we do that? That is the process that we're going through.
Have you arrived at an answer? Because I could really do with one about what the kind of the consensus view of the British public is when it comes to leaving the European Union. I mean, surely at the heart of it is the idea of divergence, that we can go in a different direction to the European Union. And what we're hearing from, amongst others, the Chancellor doesn't suggest that that's the path that he wants to take anyway.
Well, I think what the Chancellor is doing is continuing to respect the result of the referendum, which promised people a lot more money for the NHS, £350 million a week perhaps, which promised them that it would be very, very easy to negotiate new trade deals. It promised that we would all be better off. It promised that there wouldn't be changes to the Northern Ireland border. There were lots of promises made which people who voted leave voted on the basis of. Now, what the Chancellor is saying is, if we want to deliver as much as possible of what the Leave side promised the British people, then we need to go in a particular direction. The British people did not give us a blank cheque to do whatever we liked. The parliamentary democracy that we're in has respected the vote of the referendum. It has triggered Article 50 and is now negotiating with the EU. And what we are trying to do is make sure that we don't just have Brexit at all costs. We have a Brexit that will be in the national interest and that will deliver for the British people what the majority of them voted for.
But Lord Bell, wouldn't a soft Brexit, where we have continued regulatory alignment in a number of areas with the European Union, where we continue to be under the ECJ, where workers' rights are enshrined in UK law, I mean, is that the Brexit that you envisaged?
I don't. No, it's not, and it's not what I envisaged. It's not what I voted for. And it's not what anybody I know voted for.
So what can we do about the House of Lords then?
The House of Lords has a power of scrutiny, and it will scrutinise, and it'll debate, and it'll discuss, and it'll come to a conclusion. It'll pass amendments, it'll not pass amendments. Some of those amendments will be passed later on by the House of Commons. Some of them will be rejected. That's what's happened. It's a non-contentious bill.
Whilst we have both of you, once again we have allegations being laid at the door of members of the upper and lower house about access and being paid for. Are we at a stage yet where we can legitimately ask what benefit there is to the political system by having our elected and unelected representatives able to seek employment outside of their main job?
Well, inevitably they have to pay for their living. And they choose to do what they choose to do. The story in the Sunday Times is rubbish. It's just drivel. It's drivel. It's a ridiculous overstatement. It isn't. It's offensive, and it's just a piece of nonsense.
Drivel, overstated piece of nonsense?
I think it is really important that members of Parliament are seen to uphold the highest standards in public life, that they are an example to others. I haven't seen the programme. One just sees allegations. I think that my experience is the majority in the House of Lords and in the House of Commons are decent, law-abiding people who respect the position that they have been given by the British people or by the British Constitution. But I would just like to remind everyone that the bill going through the House of Lords at the moment is not about frustrating Brexit. What this bill is about protecting the constitutional integrity and legal framework for our future. And it's really important that it isn't painted as if Lords are trying to frustrate the will of the people, because that is not what is happening. We are trying to work in the national interest and advise MPs who ultimately cannot be overridden. The House of Lords is a secondary chamber. The primary decision must rest with the elected House of Commons.
Fun and games for political journalists, though, of course. Baroness Altman, Lord Bell, lovely to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
The Cabinet Minister David Lidington was talking to Andrew Marr this morning, and he was asked about the backlash on the government's Brexit strategy from Jacob Rees-Mogg and from other Conservative MPs.
Jacob, like everybody else, just needs to see how the negotiations go. We're about to start negotiations, and I'm not going to get into detail about that process. Secondly, the very fact that we will have left the European Union is a big deal indeed. The bill in front of Parliament extinguishes the power of the European Court and supranational EU law over the UK.
Well, I'm joined now by the former Cabinet Minister, Theresa Villiers. She's written a piece in today's Sunday Telegraph telling of her growing concern that Brexit is being diluted. Thank you for coming on the show. Tell us what you mean by Brexit being diluted.
Well, I have consistently argued the case for compromise and advocated and I recognise it's necessary. But what I was saying in my article this morning was that, you know, if you go too far with compromise, eventually you get to the point where we wouldn't genuinely be leaving the European Union and we wouldn't be respecting the result of the referendum.
And you're concerned that's the direction we're heading in now?
I'm concerned, and in particular, I think we must retain the right to diverge from EU laws. One of the key points of leaving the European Union is to ensure that we can once again make our own laws in our own parliament and not be subject to laws made by people we don't elect and we can't remove.
So what has suddenly made you so concerned that that's the direction in which we're heading? Is it the Chancellor saying that there only need to be very modest changes from the situation at the moment, or is it something that's happening behind the scenes?
I think it's a combination of things. I think in part it's, you know, the government faces a difficult challenge sort of convincing people on the Leave side of the debate, because so many times in the past there have been prime ministers who went off to Brussels saying it's all going to be fine, we'll sort it out, we'll bring you back a deal you like, and then, yeah, at the last minute there's been, you know, territory has been given away. We have made compromises, I accept the need for that, but I think there is only so far you can go before ultimately you find yourself in a position where you're diluting Brexit so much that it isn't leaving the European Union in a real sense.
And so when you hear Philip Hammond saying that there will only be very modest changes to our relationship with the EU once we've left, you think he is actually reflecting government policy there? I mean, it was interesting. Downing Street tried to refute what he was saying, but all they actually said was you can't call leaving the single market and the customs union a very modest change. They didn't say that we would be diverging much from their rules and regulations. And you're anxious, are you, that right at the very top they're worried about keeping fairly close alignment with the EU?
The Prime Minister set out a bold, positive vision for Brexit in her Lancaster House speech. My article today is about appealing to the government, all of them, to stick to that vision and implement it so that, you know, once we leave the European Union, we're back in control of our laws, our money and our borders.
But as you say, the Prime Minister has set this out in Lancaster House in a speech in Florence. Why do you think that she would be backsliding from that? I mean, what makes you think that anything has changed since she set out those policies?
I absolutely don't think she wants to backslide. I think what is happening, that she is under huge sustained pressure from a range of quarters to reverse the result of the referendum. So in part, you know, what I'm trying to do is to re-emphasise the positive case for Brexit and re-emphasise that whilst there are those who want to soften things up and frustrate the implementation of the referendum, there are others who are enthusiastic about going ahead and implementing that vision in the Lancaster House speech.
But who are those people you think want to frustrate it? You must be worried that they're right inside the cabinet. If you, who've previously been very loyal on this, feel motivated to come out and write a newspaper article about this, you must be worried that it's right at the top of government that there are people who would want to frustrate Brexit.
I don't believe that. I think the cabinet is united in wanting to do this. There's obviously, you know,
really? After the different views we heard this week?
This is an issue which has divided the country, it's divided all political parties. There are differences of emphasis. The key battle now is what is going to be the end state that we ask for in our negotiations. We must be asking for an end state which is based on the Lancaster House speech, which means retaining control of making our own laws in our own parliament, because that is how we become genuinely an independent country again and respect the result of the referendum.
So do you think the Chancellor was actually contravening stated government policy when he said there'd only be very modest changes? Was he out of line?
I wouldn't make sort of too much of that one comment. That comment is not what has prompted my concerns today. What I want to do is to ensure the case for a real Brexit is made. I fully acknowledge, you know, the technical scale of the exercise of withdrawing from the European Union, as Raphael was saying, It is very complicated, and that is one of the reasons why I've advocated and supported compromise. But there is only so far you can go with compromise without ultimately finding yourself in a position where you are selling out on the people who voted to leave.
Now, the next phase of the talks will be about the transition period or the implementation period before we get to the final future relationship with the EU. And we learned a little bit more about the government's approach to that this week as well. David Davis, in his speech, made it sound very much as though there will be almost no changes to free movement of people whatsoever during that 2-year transition phase. Does that concern you? I mean, that seems to be an actual change in government policy.
For me, the important issue is what happens at the end of the transition period. Now,
so you're relaxed about 2 years of transition, which look almost identical to staying in the EU?
I accept that that looks like what's going to happen, and indeed, I think there is a case for a transition period. I think my worry now is if we go into that transition period without, the clearest possible understanding of what the arrangements are when we leave. So I believe that we must have as much detail as possible in relation to our agreement with the European Union that we reach before that transition period starts. If we go into it not knowing what the end state is, that is something that would worry me.
And when it comes to the end state, what are the things you absolutely could not sign up to? If there was continuing European Court of Justice involvement in trade disputes, for instance, or what's been described as easy movement of people in and out of the UK, would that lead you to a point where it was a Brexit deal you simply couldn't agree to? Well,
I think the key issues here are the end state must allow the United Kingdom to run its own trade policy and to make its own decisions on its laws and regulations.
And so no involvement from the European Court of Justice at that point?
Well, there is the government has agreed a very limited role for the European Court of Justice, a time-limited one in relation to EU nationals. I don't see that as a big problem, but any enlargement of that role I would see as very worrying.
And do you think there's any possibility you could end up voting against this deal in Parliament?
Well, I'm not going to start making predictions about how I would vote on a deal which hasn't even been agreed yet. What I want to do is to make sure that we work together to try and bridge divisions, to come up with an agreement with the European Union which gives us a new partnership with them, which hopefully a majority can be comfortable whichever way they voted in June 2016.
Theresa Villiers, thank you very much for talking to us this morning. And joining me now from Newcastle is the Brexit Minister, Lord Callanan. Thanks for talking to us today. Can you offer any reassurance to Theresa Villiers and other members of your party who are worried about this, that the government isn't going soft on Brexit?
No, we're not going soft. There's been no backsliding on the Prime Minister's Lancaster House speech, where she set out the framework for our future relationships, and we will be regaining control of our laws, our money and our borders. We will be establishing an independent trade policy, as she set out in that speech. So there has been no backsliding. That remains the policy of the government. So Theresa's completely wrong to be worried
that Brexit is being diluted, is she?
Sorry, say that again?
Theresa Villiers is completely wrong when she says she's worried that Brexit is being diluted?
Yes, she is wrong. It's not being diluted. That remains the policy of the government. The Prime Minister is in charge of the negotiations, and we will be negotiating with our European partners in good faith. They are our friends and allies, but the objectives that we have for the negotiations remain as she set out.
So it's the Chancellor then who was completely wrong when he said there would only be very modest changes in our relationship?
No, I think that the Chancellor has said that he is supportive of government policy, he is supportive of the vision that the Prime Minister has set out.
So was he
that's how we will be negotiating
government policy when he said there'd only be modest changes in our relationship with the EU?
We will be negotiating with our European partners to bring about frictionless trading arrangements, but the important part of the negotiations is that we have to regain control of our ability to set our own rules and regulations. Now, clearly, there may be some areas where if there's a very integrated supply lines, we might want to reflect current EU regulations, but the important thing is that we decide those matters for ourselves.
Now, David Davis presumably does speak for the government when he's describing the transition phase, which is what the next stage of talks will be about. And he says that during this implementation period, people will, of course, be able to travel between the UK and the EU to live and work. That sounds like free movement is continuing as before, but we were told by the government it would end as soon as we left the EU in 2019.
Well, we will be introducing a registration scheme for new EU entrants, so we know who is coming to the country.
OK, but that's got nothing to do with leaving the EU. We could have done that right now.
To the phase where we take control of our immigration policy.
But this registration idea, this is not something that comes about because we've left the EU. We could have introduced that years ago if we wanted to. Several other European countries ask UK citizens to register when they're there. That's got nothing to do with us leaving the European Union.
Well, we still have the details of how the implementation period will operate, so let's see what the negotiations produce. But what we want to do is we want to reflect the current rules and regulations as closely as possible so that at the end of the implementation period, and it's important that is strictly time limited, we agree with the EU on that, that at the end of that state we will introduce a new immigration policy and we will be able to take control of our rules, regulations and borders.
That sounds an awful lot like continuing free movement when we were told specifically by the government that when we left the EU in 2019, free movement would end at that point. It's starting to look like a red line that's gone very pale pink.
We're about to have the negotiations. We're waiting for the EU to produce their guidelines. We will sit down in good faith with our European partners, talk about how the implementation period will work and what the end state will be.
But we don't have to wait to find out what the UK government's position is, because David Davis set it out in a speech this week and he pretty much described free movement continuing as it is.
As I said, we are having the negotiations. We're about to start them. Let's not give away our positions before we do that. We will be negotiating in good faith, and we want to reach an agreement as soon as possible so that we get certainty that business knows where we're going at the end of the period, and we will move towards the new state at the end of a strictly time-limited implementation period.
So would it be helpful if the Prime Minister were to make another speech following on from Lancaster House in Florence, where she set out clearly what the government's position is on the future direction of travel, on the transition period and on the future end state, so that instead of listening to cabinet ministers who have clearly divergent views on this, we knew from the Prime Minister what the government's policy was?
Well, we do know what the Prime Minister has said is the government's policy. The government's policy remains what she set out in detail in the Lancaster House speech, followed up by the Florence speech, where she outlined the new end state we want to end up with and the procedures for getting there. And she set it out in great detail. I can talk in detail about the 3 baskets of regulations if you want, but that was very clear. But we do need to have a negotiation at the end of the day, and Theresa has said that. There will be compromises on both sides. There were in the first phase of the negotiation. These are difficult, complicated and tricky areas.
Okay.
But we remain focused on the end state, which is that we believe in the single market, we believe in the customs union, we'll be having an independent trade policy, and we will be deciding our own rules and regulations.
Now, the EU withdrawal bill will come to the Lords this week, to your house. Are we going to see government compromise on some of the things that peers are worried about and you could potentially be defeated on in the Lords?
Well, we will be listening to the debate. We showed as the legislation went through the House of Commons that we're prepared to reflect, we're prepared to think about contributions that are made, and if people have suggestions that we agree with that will improve the legislation, then of course we will do that. The House of Lords has a very important role in revising legislation,
to government amendments on something like the Henry VIII
effectively,
powers.
And we will listen to what the debate says.
So you're open to government amendments changing the EU withdrawal bill?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
You're open to amendments changing the EU withdrawal bill on issues like the Henry VIII powers or something like that?
Well, we've already compromised on those areas in the House of Commons, so we will listen to what the debate brings. The peers take their role of scrutinising EU legislation very closely, and we will reflect on that, introduce changes if we think they are warranted.
Lord Callanan, thanks for talking to us this morning.